You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi everyone, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is about the question, how free are you? And I want to share with you a very interesting short story and sort of thought experiment by the philosopher Robert Nozick. Before we get to that though, I just want to remind you that I am putting out bonus episodes for supporters of the show on Patreon. This week's bonus episode is called Just Keep Going. And if you're interested in getting bonus episodes and my productivity templates and many other rewards, you can do so by becoming a supporter of the show on Patreon. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. You can also find out more information on my website, thevolauntarylife.com, or directly on my Patreon page at patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So in this week's show, I want to share with you a short excerpt from a book by Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick was a philosopher, quite an important philosopher in the 20th century. He wrote a book called Anarchy, State and Utopia, which was quite influential. I have been meaning to read that book for a long time. I haven't read the whole book, but I've read lots of arguments from that book in extracts that other people have discussed elsewhere. And some of the arguments that he makes in that book, I don't agree with his conclusions. And the general conclusion that he comes to in the book doesn't seem to be one that I agree with. But he does make some very interesting arguments in the book and some really interesting thought experiments. He was a philosopher, so many of the things that he wrote were very thought-provoking. So I'm going to share a very thought-provoking extract from that book in this episode, and it's called The Tale of the Slave. So this is The Tale of the Slave by Robert Nozick. Consider the following sequence of cases, which we shall call the Tale of the Slave, and imagine that it is about you. Case number 1. There is a slave completely at the mercy of his brutal master's whims. He is often cruelly beaten, called out in the middle of the night, and so on. Case number 2. The master is kindlier and beats the slave only for stated infractions of his rules, such as not fulfilling the work quota and so on. He gives the slave some free time. Case number 3. The master has a group of slaves, and he decides on how things are to be allocated among them on nice grounds, taking into account their needs, merit, and so on. Case number 4. The master allows his slaves 4 days on their own and requires them to work only 3 days a week on his land. The rest of the time is their own. Case number 5. The master allows his slaves to go off and work in the city, or anywhere they wish, for wages. He requires only that they send back to him 3/7 of their wages. He also retains the power to recall them to the plantation if some emergency threatens his land, and to raise or lower the 3/7 amount required to be turned over to him. He further retains the right to restrict the slaves from participating in certain dangerous activities that threaten his financial return, for example, mountain climbing or cigarette smoking. Case number 6. The master allows all of his 10,000 slaves, except you, to vote, and the joint decision is made by all of them. There is open discussion and so forth among them, and they have the power to determine to what uses to put whatever percentage of your and their earnings they decide to take, what activities legitimately may be forbidden to you, and so on. Let us pause in this sequence of cases to take stock. If the master contracts to transfer the power so that he cannot withdraw it, you have a change of master. You now have 10,000 masters instead of just one. Rather, you have one 10,000-headed master. Perhaps the 10,000 even will be kindlier than the benevolent master in case number 2. Still, they are your master. However, still more can be done. A kindly master, as in case 2, might allow his slaves to speak up and try to persuade him to make a certain decision. The 10,000-headed monster can do this also. Case number 7. Though still not having the vote, you're at liberty and are given the right to enter into the discussions of the 10,000 to try to persuade them to adopt various policies and to treat you and themselves in a certain way. They then go off to vote and decide upon the policies covering the vast range of their powers. Case number 8. In appreciation of your useful contribution to the discussion, the 10,000 allow you to vote if they are deadlocked. They commit themselves to this procedure. After the discussion, you mark your vote on a slip of paper and they go off and vote. In the eventuality that they divide evenly on some issue, 5,000 for and 5,000 against, they look at your ballot and count it in. This has never yet happened. They have never yet had occasion to open your ballot. A single master might also commit himself to letting his slave decide any issue concerning him about which he, the master, was absolutely indifferent. Case number 9. They throw your vote in with theirs. If they are exactly tied, your vote carries the issue. Otherwise, it makes no difference to the electoral outcome. The question is, which transition from case 1 to case 9 made it no longer the tale of a slave? So that was The Tale of the Slave by Robert Nozick. I think it is a very thought-provoking story. It's really thought-provoking because everybody understands that case number 1, which is basically just chattel slavery, is morally totally unacceptable. And everyone understands that case number 9 is pretty much what we have today in the West, which most people think is the most decent kind of good, free society that you can have. And the tricky thing is, how do you pick a point between case number 1, which was full slavery, and case number 9, which is kind of where we are today, where you say, oh, well, that's where we became free. That's the difference between being a slave and being free. Because if you want to say that case number 1 is terrible and morally reprehensible, but case number 9 is morally good and great, then you have to pick an in-between point to say, this is where I think it starts to become okay. And in order to do that, you have to decide what the principle is that you're using to decide what is acceptable and what is not in terms of freedom and coercion and aggression. And I've read a few responses to this story online and different ways that different people have responded. And some people do pick a case in between case 1 and case 9 to say, this is where it becomes okay. Or at least they say, this is where it stops being slavery. And so some of the examples I've read is one person said, well, the difference is that when you don't have to work anymore, then it's no longer slavery. So slaves are beaten if they don't work, whereas if you're just having to give up some of your earnings, that's not slavery because you don't necessarily have to earn. If you don't want to, you can just not work. And I think that's an interesting response. I mean, leaving aside the fact that even that isn't necessarily true because there are some taxes that you have to pay that are not income taxes, even if you don't work. But nonetheless, even if you accept that case number 9 is not slavery in the classic sense, I think everyone gets that in some sense we still have masters. There are ways in which we are still not free. We're certainly not slaves like case number 1, but we kind of still have masters. So maybe in the West today there's some version of servitude that isn't slavery, but it's like a sort of free-range version. And the masters are essentially the state. And behind the state are all the people who vote for the politicians who enact different laws and rules and regulations that you have to follow. In the way that Robert Nozick put it, you have a 10,000-headed master, or you could say a many million-headed master, if you think about it in terms of people voting. But trying to think through and answer Robert Nozick's question and pick a point between slavery and the modern democratic state and show this is where it becomes acceptable, trying to do that really forces you to think through your principles and to be clear about what your principles are. And the interesting thing is, that's why most of the people who respond to this story refuse to answer the question. Most of the people who've written about this, who try and refute Robert Nozick's point, don't even attempt to answer the question. They just refuse to answer it. They say that, oh, well, some things are a matter of gradation, and that doesn't make it the same. It just means that it's hard to pick a point or something. But they just refuse to answer. And I think that's intellectually dishonest, because if you agree that case number 1, pure slavery, is truly evil, and case number 9 is kind of where we are now, then even if it's a matter of gradation, you must be able to pick somewhere in between those two cases where you think it stops being immoral and starts being okay for you to be subject to some kind of master. Now, there are definitely massive, massive differences between case 1 and case 9. And I would much rather live in case 9 than I would in case 1. And so it can be useful to call these cases different things, and to say there's a difference between case 1, like pure slavery, and case 9, and it doesn't make sense to call that the same thing. But in terms of principles, I think there's a very important similarity in that there is still a master in all of those cases. And if you think about it in terms of principles like the principle of voluntary consent, then there are still very important ways in which case 9 has not reached proper voluntary consent and still involves aggression or coercion. I don't see any principled basis for people to have masters. I like the quote by the Enlightenment thinker Condorcet when he said, "The moment will come then when the sun will shine only on free men on this earth, on men who will recognize no master but their reason." It's not pleasant to think about how free you are and to realize how unprincipled some things that we take for granted can be. For example, just because 10,000 people or 10 million people vote on something, it doesn't make it right. And I think the fact that it's so unpleasant and demeaning to think about how unfree in some ways you really are, I think that's the reason why people refuse to answer Robert Nozick's question, refuse to pick a point and say this is where things become okay between slavery and between life in a modern democratic state. But the irony is, I think the clearer you can be in terms of your thinking, the more free you are. Because one of the great things about the times that we live in is that you can think for yourself. And that's a hugely important aspect of being free. The German poet and Enlightenment thinker Goethe put it really well when he said, "None are so hopelessly enslaved as those who falsely believe they are free." So I hope you found that interesting. I certainly found it to be a very thought-provoking piece. But let me know what you think. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevolauntarylife.com to learn more.